Shalom. My name is Todd Bennett, and I'd like to welcome you to this new installment in the Leaving Babylon series. During the last episode, we spoke about leaving organized religion and spending some time in the wilderness so that you could hear the voice of Elohim and learn his ways. And I encourage you to begin by keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. Now, Christianity, primarily rooted from the Roman Catholic Church, changed the Sabbath, at least they changed their Sabbath, from the seventh day to the first day of the week, from Saturday to Sunday on our common Gregorian calendar. Now, they did it to demonstrate the mark of authority of the Roman Catholic Church. So even the Catholic Church understands that the Sabbath is a sign or a mark, and they believe that by changing Elohim's Sabbath from the seventh day to the first day, they've demonstrated their mark of the authority of the Roman Catholic Church to change the commandments. And of course, that's a huge mistake, a very big error, and one of the many errors that people are discovering that exist in the Christian church. So I encourage people to begin celebrating the seventh-day Sabbath and observing the seventh-day Sabbath so they could demonstrate that they're no longer part of that Roman Catholic Church establishment, but that rather they're part of the assembly of Yisrael. Now, the Hebrew word for sign is ot, and it also means a mark, and it's essentially something that's visible, something that people can see. And so when you're observing the seventh-day Sabbath, while the rest of the world is running around doing their own pleasures and shopping and having a good time, you're resting in your dwelling places. And it's a visible sign that you belong to Yisrael and you're in covenant with the Elohim of Yisrael. So it's a weekly appointed time when you're actually able to synchronize your life with the Creator and His kingdom. And it's actually the first of the appointed times that we read about in Leviticus 23. Now let's look at what Leviticus 23 has to say about the Sabbath in verses 1 through 4. It says, "And Yahuwah spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, The feasts of Yahuwah, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of Yahuwah in all your dwellings. These are the feasts of Yahuwah, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times." Now, if you read this verse in your scriptures, you'll notice that the command concerning the Sabbath is in verse 3, Leviticus 23:3, and it's bracketed by verses 2 and 4, which essentially are saying the same thing. 2 says, The feasts of Yahuwah, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts. And 4 says, these are the feasts of Yahuwah, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed time. So essentially these two verses bracket the command regarding the Sabbath. So it's separated from the other Moedim that are tied to specific days and months of the year. The count of the Sabbath began actually during the first week of creation. In fact, the Sabbath is only tied to a 7-day count that started in Genesis 1. It's a weekly appointment that operates separately from the annual appointed times that are tied to both months and days, and therefore they're determined by the sun and the moon, as we read about in Genesis 1:14. Now, there's some people who come out of Babylon and they think that everything is wrong, and they're so concerned about getting rid of errors and lies that they end up running into a whole new set of false doctrines and false beliefs that get them into trouble. That's why I suggest that you really take your time, start to observe Shabbat, listen to His voice in the quiet of the peace of Shabbat instead of all the noise that you'll hear on the internet, because There's a lot of false doctrines out there, and some people are struggling with what's called the lunar Sabbath, which attempts to link the weekly Sabbath with the lunar cycle, which really is quite chaotic, and it's very confusing for many people. It has absolutely no basis in the Scriptures, and it has no support in history, and there's no way that you can actually combine the 7-day Sabbath cycle with the moon that has an average cycle of 29.53 days. You just can't fit a Sabbath cycle into a moon cycle. It doesn't work mathematically, and of course there's no basis for it in the Scriptures. And I talk about that more in the Time and the Calendar series, as well as my book, The Sabbath. But there's really not a lot of sense in spending a lot of time trying to disprove a negative. I just wanted to mention that's one error that people are getting into that you should avoid. Now, we first read about the Sabbath during creation week. Genesis 2:1 says, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day Elohim ended his work which he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from his work which he had done. Then Elohim blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which Elohim had created and made." So this culminated the first week of creation and established the second reckoning of time, the 7-day week. The day was the first reckoning and begins in the evening and continues through the following evening. And that's another potential error that people are falling into. Some are being lured into a boker to boker or sunrise to sunset reckoning. But again, neither of these are supported by Scriptures or history. And I also talk a bit more about this in the Time and the Calendar teaching series that we're working on, and some of it is online now. The Hebrews always reckoned a day from evening to evening, and this was the calendar in existence at the time of Yeshua. And he never said anything against it or about it. And by all accounts, he was operating under the same calendar as Yisrael. In fact, we read about John the Baptist, John the Immerser's parents. They were both of the Levitic line, Zacharias and Elisheva. And the Scriptures recount in Luke that they were perfect according to the Torah. And Zacharias, his father, was a priest. And you can't serve in the temple and be considered perfect according to all the ways of the Torah if the temple was operating on a different calendar. So obviously, by all accounts, the Israelites were operating under the proper calendar during the time of Yeshua. And so we know how they were determining a day, and we know how they were determining the Sabbath. So these really aren't issues to debate. They're not in question, and it's just a real distraction to get drawn down these various rabbit holes that people are following in their quest for truth. They're actually being deceived. So the Sabbath occurs every seventh day, beginning after sunset at what we would call Friday evening on the Gregorian calendar. In fact, what makes the Sabbath so special and so unique is that it occurs every 7 days. There's no mention of the moon determining the first Sabbath. In fact, the moon was not mentioned in the Scriptures during creation week until day 4. So the week count wasn't tied to the moon, although the annual appointed times, the Moedim, are determined by the sun and the moon. And we see this through Genesis 1:14 as well as Leviticus 23:4. And we'll talk about the importance of the annual appointed times in a future teaching in this series. But for now, the seventh-day Sabbath is unique and it's special, and it's so important that it's found in the fourth commandment given to Israel from Mount Sinai. We find it in Exodus 28-11. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy," which means set apart, Kodesh. "6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of Yahuwah, your Elohim. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days Yahuwah made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore Yahuwah blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." Now notice again the emphasis on the seventh day, because it's only tied to the week count that began at creation. And our primary understanding is that it's holy, set apart from all other days. It's not to be common, and therefore no work is to be done. The Hebrew word for work is malakah. And generally, it means manual labor, industry, business, things that are common and could be done on the other 6 days you're not supposed to do on the Shabbat. And this was interpreted in Amos and Nehemiah to include shopping, trading, and the like. And of course, the Melachah that Elohim rested from was creation itself, creative work. So this leads to the big question that I get all the time. So, is it work? Is it not work? Can I do this or can I do that? And many people want a list, but in doing so, they're really missing the point of this weekly exercise. When asked that question, I typically refer people to the commandments. And the Scriptures provide only 7 commandments that I can see, and we already mentioned 6 of them. First, 6 days you work. So that's affirmative. We're supposed to work for 6 days. No work on a 7th day. We're supposed to rest on the 7th day. We're supposed to set it apart, make it kadosh. Do no work, and don't make others work on that day. And Leviticus 23:3 says, "You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of Yahuwah in all your dwellings." Okay, so it specifically shows we're supposed to observe it in our dwellings. And then a 7th commandment is found in Exodus 35:3. "You shall kindle no fire throughout your dwellings on the Sabbath day." Now, that's generally associated with cooking. We already saw in the last section of this series how the Sabbath was linked with the manna and the preparation of food, and they were to collect extra manna on the 6th day, so they didn't have to prepare and cook on a Sabbath day. So it's generally understood that this kindling of fire refers to the whole process of preparing to cook and cooking. But this specific commandment is also the subject of great controversy. In other words, does turning on a light or turning on the ignition of an automobile involve kindling a fire? So there's questions that people have, and while the commandments themselves are fairly simple, there are different issues that come up in interpreting the commandments. And the religion of Judaism, as most have figured out at this point, if you're observing the Sabbath, it's developed hundreds of rules and regulations concerning the Sabbath, and attempted to address every possible situation that you can ever be confronted with on the Sabbath. But I repeatedly warn people about turning to Judaism for answers and looking to the rabbis for their solutions to these situations, because their oral Torah that they've developed is actually adding to the Torah, which is against the Scriptures. And what is permissible and not permissible according to the Torah is called binding and loosing. And Yeshua referenced this in the Gospels, and so we should look to him for these types of answers. And we read about it in Matthew 16. And we actually have a teaching online called The Gates of Hell, where we had our Shavuot 2016 group up in Banyas, and we talked about this issue there. You might find it interesting. But essentially, Yeshua warned his disciples about the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the leaven was their doctrine. They thought they had the power to interpret the Torah through binding and loosing. In other words, what can be done and what cannot be done according to the Torah, binding and loosing. And so the Sadducees and Pharisees thought they had that authority. And Yeshua had already declared that he was the master of the Sabbath when they challenged him on what could be done on the Sabbath. He was with his disciples, and they were questioning something that he was doing and saying it was forbidden according to their understanding, their binding and loosing of the Shabbat and the Torah commandments concerning the Shabbat. But he specifically said he's the master of the Sabbath, so that would mean that he has the power to bind and loose and to determine what's acceptable and what's not acceptable to do on the Shabbat. And we read about that specifically in Matthew 12. So essentially, this was the same old authority issue that Yeshua was dealing with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And he was saying he had the authority, and he conferred that authority on his disciples. We read about that in Matthew 16:19. He says, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." So the Pharisees and the Sadducees thought they had the power, but Yeshua gave it to his disciples. So we don't want to look at rabbinic Judaism, which is derives directly from the Pharisees. We don't want to look to the Pharisees for these answers when Yeshua specifically said they don't have the power, I'm giving it to you. And Yeshua, of course, sent his Spirit to help us, and we now have the ability to determine these issues. And of course, that's the entire point of the Sabbath, to hear his voice and to follow his ways. Now, the last time, in our last episode, I encouraged people to treasure their time in the wilderness before they searched out and joined some new group or fellowship. And this leads to another question, do we fellowship or not on the Sabbath? And of course, my answer always is it depends. How far away is this fellowship and what's involved in getting to and from the fellowship. If it's just a matter of, walking down the street, of course, that's not a problem at all. But if you have to, get your family together and it takes you, an hour or so to get them packed up into the car and you have to drive for an hour or more and then, it's just an exhausting procedure, then you've really got to question whether this is really keeping the Sabbath or not. And of course, this issue deals with two specific commandments both found in Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23:3 again says, 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of Yahuwah in all your dwellings. We already mentioned that. So, the Sabbath is set apart. It's kadosh, and in fact, it's called a kadosh mikra. It's a set-apart rehearsal or set-apart assembly. So there is that aspect of assembling together involved there. But there's also that second aspect of in all your dwellings. So what do we do about that? The Sabbath is a set-apart rehearsal or a gathering that is in our dwellings. Well, the Hebrew word for dwelling is moshav, and that generally refers to one's neighborhood or community, not necessarily just your house. And so then many people ask if there's a specific distance that you can travel on the Sabbath. And while there's no specific number of steps or miles or feet found in the Torah, we see a reference to a Sabbath day's journey in Acts 1:12. And that reads, Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day journey away. Now, in this instance, we understand there's a connection with Bethpage on the Mount of Olives. And during the last week of Yeshua's life before his crucifixion, he made a specific point to direct attention to Bethpage. And Bethpage was on the Mount of Olives, and it was actually considered to be on the border of the city limits of Jerusalem. And that's why the Mount of Olives is mentioned in this passage. So they walked to the border of their Moshav, which was Jerusalem. They were dwelling in Jerusalem at the time. And the Sabbath day journey was therefore within their dwellings. They walked, up to the Mount of Olives and back. And so they never left their Moshav, their community. So they kept the Sabbath in their dwelling places. So if gathering involves work and effort and travel beyond your Moshav, then I suggest you remain in your dwelling place, which is your community. Now, maybe it's just not time yet for you to join a fellowship. Maybe you need to continue to pray that Yah would bring people to you in your community that you can fellowship with. Maybe you're the beginning of a new community in your area. Maybe the Kadosh Mikra or the rehearsal will occur in your home. So there's all sorts of possibilities here that you need to, again, don't rush into things. Take your time, pray about it, and just determine, through the guiding of the Holy Spirit, what's the appropriate thing for you. And of course, these are considerations that we make prayerfully and with the guidance of the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh. After all, the set-apart Spirit is the one who guides us in these matters of being set apart, and that's what the Sabbath is all about. Now, this leads me to one final piece of advice. When we're considering the Sabbath, there's a possible eighth commandment that provides insight into the mystery of the final appointed time that we read about in Leviticus 23, the eighth day, Shemini Etzeret. And it involves calling the Sabbath a delight, and it's found in Isaiah 58:13 through 14, which reads, If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of Yahuwah honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words, Then you shall delight yourself in Yahuwah, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Yaakov your father. The mouth of Yahuwah has spoken. So that's really the goal. When your Sabbath transcends from a list of do's and don'ts and becomes a delight, when you truly delight in Yahuwah and His Shabbat and ride on the high hills of the earth, you've achieved it. That's what Shabbat is supposed to teach us on a weekly basis as we prepare ourselves for life in the kingdom of Elohim. And that's the expectation that we have on First Shemini Etzeret, the rehearsal that we follow every year, the last feast in month 7, the end of month 7. Now, I hope you're able to experience that joy and that peace, which is truly what we mean when we wish each other Shabbat Shalom every week. And I hope you found this teaching to be helpful and the guidance in here to maybe give you some further direction on how you should observe your Shabbat. Of course, as I mentioned last time, we have the book, The Sabbath, which is part of our Walk in the Light series. And of course, it's meant to tell you about the commandments concerning Shabbat. It doesn't give you a list of do's and don'ts because, again, that's not the point. But it does help you get the history and the background as far as why we should be observing Shabbat. And you can find this along with our other books and different articles at our website, www.shemaisrael.net. And my name is Todd Bennett. And until next time, Shalom.